Clara's fingers glided over the ivory keys with a precision that belied her tender age, drawing from the harpsichord a melody that echoed through the corridors of Raven's Hollow Palace like a whispered lament. The young woman did not know that every note reached the ears of Aldrich Whitmore, Duke of Ravenshollow, who had stopped before the half-open music-room door, unable to move away from that harmony which seemed to touch his grieving soul directly. At 45, Aldrich believed he had forever buried any possibility of his heart beating with vigor again. His wife, Lady Margaret's death 3 years prior, had left a void he considered insurmountable. His only concern now was his 15-year-old daughter Isabella, whose musical education had been neglected since they were bereft of Margaret's delicate touch on the harpsichord. The music ceased abruptly, and Aldrich realized he had been discovered. Through the gap in the door, Clara's brown eyes met his, and for an instant that seemed eternal. The world around them disappeared. She was young, too young, his sense of propriety screamed, but there was something in her gaze that belied her 19 years. A premature maturity, perhaps forged by the responsibilities life had thrust upon her too soon. "Your Grace?" Clara immediately rose, curtsying respectfully. Her grey-blue muslin dress, though simple and clearly not of the finest silk, was impeccably arranged. Every movement revealed a refined education that intrigued Aldrich. "I beg your pardon if the music disturbed you." On the contrary, Miss Pemberton, Aldrich entered the salon, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. "It has been a long time since these walls heard such a touching performance." The palace's music room was one of the most lavish rooms on the estate. Walls paneled in polished mahogany displayed portraits of Whitmore ancestors, while crimson velvet curtains framed windows that overlooked the formal gardens. The harpsichord, a magnificent piece brought from Vienna, occupied the center of the room, surrounded by gilded brocade armchairs where the family used to sit during musical performances. "Your daughter shows great natural talent," Clara said, arranging the sheet music on the instrument. "Lady Isabella has delicate fingers and a keen ear. With proper instruction, she will surely become an accomplished musician." Aldrich observed the young teacher's graceful gestures. Clara had arrived at Ravenshollow only a week ago, recommended by Reverend Ashworth of the local parish. Her story was known throughout the surrounding area. An orphan since 16, she had taken on the responsibility of raising 2 younger siblings, supporting her family through music and embroidery lessons for ladies of the country gentry. "And where did you learn to play with such mastery, Miss Pemberton?" The question came out more intimately than Aldrich intended. There was something about her presence that disconcerted him, making him momentarily forget the formalities that governed their social interactions. "My father was a court musician to the Prince Regent, before settling in our county," Clara replied, her cheeks flushing lightly. "He taught me from a young age. He used to say that music was the purest language of the soul." The mention of the soul made Aldrich avert his gaze. For 3 years he doubted he still possessed one. The guilt he carried over Margaret's death. She had died during a fever epidemic while he was traveling to London on matters of the crown, had turned his heart to stone. Or so he believed, until he heard those melodies that seemed to awaken parts of himself he thought dead forever. "Has Isabella proven to be a dedicated student?" he asked, forcing himself to keep the conversation in safe territory. "Very dedicated, Your Grace. Although, if I may venture an observation, she seems to carry a sadness that sometimes interferes with her concentration." Clara's frankness surprised him. Most people avoided mentioning the grief that still hung over the palace like a persistent fog. But there was something in the way she spoke, without undue pity, but with a genuine understanding born of her own experience. "Lady Isabella lost her mother very young," Aldrich admitted, his voice deepening. "I fear I have not been the father she needed during these difficult years." Clara looked at him directly, and Aldrich felt exposed under that penetrating gaze. "Grief has its own time, Your Grace, for fathers as well as for daughters." At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor, and Isabella burst into the salon, her golden curls dancing beneath her lace cap. "Papa, Miss Clara! I was looking for you everywhere." The genuine joy on the teenager's face at finding them together did not go unnoticed by Aldrich. Since the teacher's arrival, Isabella seemed more animated, more like the vivacious girl she had been before the family tragedy. "We were just discussing your lessons." Clara smiled warmly at the young woman. "Your father was asking me about your progress." "Oh, Papa, she is a wonderful teacher." Isabella ran to Aldrich, taking his arm with the familiarity of a much-loved daughter. "Miss Clara knows the most beautiful songs, and she's teaching me the sonata Mama used to play." Aldrich's heart tightened. Margaret adored that Mozart sonata. In the first months after her passing, he had locked the music room, unable to bear the memories each melody evoked. "I thought it might be comforting for Lady Isabella to connect with her mother's memory through music," Clara said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "But if your Grace prefers—" "No," Aldrich interrupted, surprising himself. "No, that is quite right, Margaret. Lady Margaret would be pleased to know that Isabella is learning her favorite pieces." The smile Clara gave him was like a ray of sunshine breaking through stormy clouds. For the first time in years, Aldrich felt a strange sense of lightness in his chest. "Miss Clara promised I could perform the sonata at the Earl of Ashworth's autumn ball," Isabella added, animated. "I can't I, Papa?" The mention of the region's most important social event made Aldrich hesitate. The ball would gather all the local aristocracy, including families who observed every movement of the House of Whitmore with critical interest. Presenting Isabella publicly would be his official reintegration into society after the period of mourning. "If Miss Pemberton believes she will be prepared," he said finally, "then we can certainly consider it." The contentment that shone in Clara's brown eyes was almost his undoing. Aldrich realized, with a mixture of fascination and alarm, that he was beginning to eagerly anticipate the moments when their routines crossed paths on the estate. Whether during Isabella's lessons or in casual encounters in the gardens, each interaction with the young teacher left him more disturbed and, paradoxically, more alive than he had felt in years. When Clara and Isabella moved to the harpsichord to continue the lesson, Aldrich remained a few more minutes in the room, observing the patience and affection with which the teacher guided his daughter. There was something deeply seductive in her competence, in the way she transformed the rigidity of musical technique into a pure expression of feeling. As he walked back to his quarters, Aldrich could not shake off the feeling that his life, carefully organized around duty and responsibility, was beginning to show signs of a transformation he wasn't sure he was prepared to face. Dawn broke timidly over the gardens of Raven's Hollow as Clara descended the service stairs leading to the palace staff quarters. Her morning routine always began before the Whitmore family awoke, allowing her a few precious hours of solitude to write letters to her siblings, who remained at Reverend Ashworth's parsonage. This morning, however, her thoughts were divided between the words she should send to Edmund and Sophia and the persistent images of the Duke that insisted on populating her mind. The way he had observed her hands on the keyboard, the intensity of his gaze when she mentioned the language of the soul. Clara felt her cheeks warm as she recalled those moments of unexpected connection. "Foolishness," she murmured to herself, organizing the music books on the small desk in her room. At 19, she had already learned that romantic dreams were luxuries a young woman in her position could not afford. Her responsibility to her siblings demanded pragmatism, not fantasies about men impossibly distant from her social sphere. The chapel tower clock chimed 7, signaling it was time to head to the small salon where she took breakfast with the other senior staff of the household. Clara adjusted her dark green wool dress, her second-best garment, reserved for working days, and pinned her brown hair in a simple but elegant chignon. The corridor separating the staff quarters from the rest of the palace was long and discreet, designed to allow servants to circulate without disturbing the family. Portraits of previous dukes adorned the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow Clara's steps as she walked. All possessed the same haughty bearing as Aldrich, the same aristocratic line of the jaw that she had begun to know too well. "Miss Pemberton." Mr. Hartwell's voice, the head butler, echoed down the corridor. The middle-aged man, impeccably dressed in his dark livery, approached with measured steps. "His Grace has requested to see you in his private apartments after breakfast." Clara felt her heart involuntarily quicken. Is there a problem with Lady Isabella's lessons? I couldn't say, miss. His Grace merely asked me to inform you that he awaits you in the private library at 8:30. Precisely. The rest of breakfast passed in a blur of conversations that Clara barely managed to follow. Mrs. Pembridge, the governess, chattered about preparations for the Earl of Ashworth's visit the following week, while Mr. Davies, the Duke's private secretary, consulted an endless list of social engagements. Clara merely agreed politely, her mind completely absorbed by the prospect of the impending meeting. When she finally made her way to the ducal apartments, Clara tried to control her irregular breathing. The palace's main corridor was a spectacle of elegance. Persian carpets covered the marble floor, while crystal chandeliers reflected the golden light filtering through the tall windows. Each step echoed softly, creating a discreet symphony that accompanied her walk. Aldrich's private library was located in the east wing of the palace, a sanctuary of knowledge that reflected both the refinement and melancholy of its owner. When Clara tapped delicately on the carved door, the Duke's deep voice invited her in. The room took her breath away. Oak shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that exuded the comforting scent of old parchment. A marble fireplace warmed the chamber, its flames dancing and casting golden shadows on the mahogany furniture. Aldrich stood before one of the windows, his imposing silhouette outlined against the morning light. "Miss Pemberton," he turned as he heard her enter. "I thank you for answering my summons. At your service." "Your Grace," Clara curtsied, forcing herself to keep her gaze respectfully low. His proximity in the confined space of the library made her aware of every detail, the discreet scent of sandalwood emanating from his clothes, the way the light highlighted the silver threads at his temples, the natural elegance of his movements. "I have a proposition to make to you," Aldrich began, moving to a table where papers were neatly spread. "The Earl of Ashworth mentioned in his last letter that he plans to include musical performances during his visit to us. In addition to Isabella's performance, he would like there to be additional entertainment for his guests." Clara looked up, intrigued. "What kind of entertainment, Your Grace?" "A recital. Chamber music, perhaps some solo harpsichord pieces." Aldrich paused, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "I was wondering if you might be interested in participating." The invitation was so unexpected that Clara needed a few seconds to process its implications. Participating in an aristocratic social event, even as a hired musician, represented an extraordinary opportunity. However, it also meant exposure, public scrutiny, the possibility of malicious comments about her humble origins. "It would be an honor, Your Grace," she finally replied, "but I fear I do not possess suitable attire for such an occasion." "That detail can be easily resolved," Aldrich said quickly, almost as if he had anticipated the objection. "Mrs. Pembridge has contacts with the finest seamstresses in the region. An appropriate dress would be provided." There was something in the urgency of his response that made Clara look at him more intently. The Duke avoided her gaze, concentrating on the papers before him with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the importance of the documents. "May I ask why Your Grace thought of me for such a role?" The question escaped her before she could contain it. Aldrich finally looked up, and Clara found herself captured by the depth of his gray-blue gaze. For a moment that stretched beyond appropriate social conventions, they simply observed each other, a silent communication passing between them. "Your music possesses an exceptional quality," he said slowly. "It would be a waste not to share it with others who would appreciate it." Clara felt the blush creep up her cheeks. There was something in the way he had pronounced the word exceptional that made her heart beat irregularly. "Your Grace is too kind." "It is not kindness, Miss Pemberton. It is recognizing talent where it exists." The silence that followed was heavy with a tension Clara did not know how to interpret. Aldrich moved slightly closer, and she could perceive the internal struggle playing out on his aristocratic features. Desire was there, but also resistance, as if he fought against impulses that his social position and sense of propriety condemned. "How long has it been since you played for a larger audience?" he asked, his voice taking on a more intimate tone. "Since before my parents' death," Clara admitted. My father occasionally took me to play in friends' homes, but that was more than 3 years ago. And do you miss it? The performance, the recognition? The question touched a wound Clara rarely allowed herself to examine. In the years dedicated to supporting her siblings, she had deeply buried her own dreams and ambitions. Music had remained merely a means of subsistence, not a source of personal fulfillment. At times, she replied honestly, but I have learned that we must content ourselves with the blessings we are granted. Blessings, Aldrich repeated as if savoring the word. An admirable perspective, though I wonder if you do not underestimate your own significance. Before Clara could reply, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor, followed by Isabella's animated voice. "Papa, is Miss Clara there? I need to show her the variation I have managed to master." The intrusion of reality made both of them involuntarily recoil. Aldrich moved to the door with movements that betrayed a certain agitation, while Clara mentally organized her disturbed feelings. "Come in, my dear," Aldrich called, his voice regaining its appropriate paternal tone. Isabella burst into the library like a gale of youthful energy, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Miss Clara."
"I practiced the passage you showed me yesterday and finally managed to execute it flawlessly."
"What wonderful news, Lady Isabella," Clara smiled, genuinely pleased with her pupil's progress. "I am eager to hear it. Miss Pemberton has agreed to participate in the recital during the Earl's visit," Aldrich informed his daughter, carefully observing the teenager's reaction. "Oh, how splendid!" Isabella clapped her hands, delighted. "Can we play together? Papa, would that be possible?" The suggestion made Aldrich's eyes gleam with an approval that warmed Clara's heart. "If Miss Pemberton agrees, we can certainly arrange something suitable." As Isabella chattered about the musical possibilities opening up, Clara realized she had just accepted far more than a simple professional commitment. The look Aldrich directed at her over his daughter's head carried promises and perils she had barely begun to comprehend. The morning had unfolded entirely differently than she had imagined upon waking, and Clara sensed that the coming days would bring even deeper changes to her carefully structured life at Ravenshollow. The sound of the harpsichord echoed through the music room like a whispered confession, each note laden with an intensity Clara had never allowed herself to express so openly. It was her 3rd week at Ravenshollow, and the recital rehearsals had become the focal point of her days, as well as the source of a growing unease she struggled to understand. Aldrich remained leaning against the doorframe, watching her play the Bach sonata they had chosen for her solo performance. He had been doing this frequently, appearing during her morning rehearsals with increasingly less convincing excuses about checking preparations or consulting Isabella about event details. Clara knew he was there just to listen to her, and that certainty made her hands tremble slightly on the keys. "The passage in the 2nd movement," he said when she finished the piece. "There's something different about the way you interpreted it today." Clara turned on the harpsichord bench, meeting those gray-blue eyes that seemed to see through her carefully constructed defenses. "Different how, Your Grace?" Aldrich fully entered the salon, closing the door behind him with a care that made Clara's heart quicken. They had never truly been alone since that first encounter in the library, always with Isabella nearby or some member of the household staff passing through the corridors. "More personal," he said finally, approaching the harpsichord, "as if you were telling a story only you know." Clara's cheeks warmed. That was precisely what had happened. She had allowed her confused and growing feelings for him to seep into the music, transforming the impeccable technique into something dangerously revealing. "Music must touch the soul," she murmured, repeating the words her father used to say. "Otherwise they are just notes arranged in the air." "And what story was your soul telling, Miss Pemberton?" The question was too intimate, crossing boundaries Clara knew should not be crossed. But there was something in Aldrich's voice, a vulnerability that mirrored her own, that made her respond with dangerous honesty. The story of someone who has discovered they desire things they can never possess. The silence that followed was dense as velvet. Aldrich took another step towards her, and Clara could see the struggle playing out on his aristocratic features. Desire and propriety warred openly, and for the first time desire seemed to be winning. "Clara," he said her name without the formal title, and the sound was like a caress. "Do you know what you make me feel?" She should have stood up, created distance, reminded him of his position and hers. Instead, she remained seated on the harpsichord bench, gazing at him with her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You shouldn't," she whispered. "We shouldn't—" "No," he agreed, but continued to approach. "We shouldn't, and yet—" Aldrich stopped before her, so close that Clara could feel the warmth emanating from his body. When he hesitantly raised his hand towards her face, she closed her eyes, allowing herself for a moment to forget all the reasons why this was impossible. The touch of his fingers against her face was so delicate that she almost doubted it was real. When she opened her eyes again, she found him watching her with an expression of reverence that made her tremble. "You are so young," he said, as if speaking to himself. "So young, and you already carry so much weight on your shoulders." "Age is merely in the numbers," Clara replied, repeating the words he himself had said weeks before. "Some souls are born old, shaped by circumstance." The mention of his own words drew a melancholic smile from Aldrich. "Do you think my soul is too old for yours?" "I think your soul is wounded," she replied softly. "And perhaps it needs new music to heal it." The musical analogy made something break in Aldrich's careful control. He leaned slightly, and Clara thought he was going to kiss her. Instead, he rested his forehead against hers, his irregular breath mingling with hers. "This is madness," he murmured against her lips. "Yes," she agreed, but did not pull away. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor. Aldrich recoiled immediately, the ducal mask reforming over his features with a swiftness that left Clara dizzy. When Isabella entered the salon moments later, she found them in perfectly proper positions, he examining sheet music on the harpsichord, she organizing music books. "Papa!" "Miss Clara." Isabella radiated excitement. "The dressmaker has arrived." "Mrs. Pembridge said I should call Miss Clara for the measurements for the recital dress." Clara rose from the bench on legs that felt like jelly. "Of course, Lady Isabella. I will come at once." She passed Aldrich without looking at him, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze burning into her back as she left the salon accompanied by the young woman. Mrs. Whitworth's improvised atelier occupied the blue salon, with fabrics spread out over all available surfaces and a dress form positioned near the windows for better light. The dressmaker, a middle-aged woman with a keen eye for detail, circled around Clara with the skill of one who had dressed the aristocracy for decades. She murmured, taking measurements with a tape measure. Elegant bearing, well-set shoulders. What color did His Grace suggest? His Grace did not specify, Clara replied, aware that Isabella was observing everything with increasing interest. Sapphire blue, Isabella said decisively. It would enhance Miss Clara's eyes and look stunning under the chandelier light. Mrs. Whitworth nodded approvingly. Lady Isabella has excellent taste. I have a sapphire-hued silk brocade that would be perfect. A modest but elegant neckline, 3/4 sleeves with Brussels lace. As the dressmaker continued her notes, Clara could barely concentrate on the details. Her mind remained in the music room, reliving every second of those stolen moments with Aldrich. The way he had touched her face, the vulnerability in his voice, the almost desperate intensity with which he had gazed at her. Miss Clara. Isabella's voice brought her back to the present. Are you well? You seem distant. Just thinking about the recital, Clara lied softly. It is natural to be nervous. Oh, but you needn't worry. Papa said you play like an angel. Isabella paused, tilting her head with curiosity. He has spoken a great deal about you lately. Clara's heart almost stopped. He has? Yes. Yesterday at dinner. He mentioned how rare it is to find someone with such natural talent. And this morning he asked Mrs. Pembridge if you were comfortable in your quarters, if you needed anything additional. Each revelation was a sweet torment. Clara forced herself to maintain a neutral expression while Mrs. Whitworth continued her measurements. Your father has always been attentive to the household staff, she said carefully. Oh, but this is different, Isabella insisted with the keen perception of adolescence. He never showed so much interest in the other teachers I had. And sometimes I find him standing outside the music room when you are practicing, just listening. The confirmation that Aldrich actively sought out her music made something contract in Clara's chest. It was dangerous and inappropriate, but also deeply touching to imagine the lonely Duke finding solace in her melodies. "Perhaps he just appreciates good music," she suggested weakly. "Perhaps," Isabella agreed, but there was a mischievous glint in her eyes that suggested she suspected much more. When she finally managed to escape the improvised atelier, Clara headed to the gardens, desperately needing fresh air and space to organize her disturbed thoughts. Raven's formal garden was a geometrically perfect labyrinth of trimmed hedges and flower beds, with a central fountain where waters danced under the golden afternoon light. She found refuge in a marble pavilion situated at the eastern extremity of the gardens, a place usually deserted at this hour. Sitting on the stone bench, Clara finally allowed herself to process the magnitude of what was happening. She was falling in love with the Duke of Ravenshollow, not merely developing a youthful infatuation or being seduced by his position and wealth, but genuinely connecting with the man behind the titles. The pain he carried echoed her own, and there was a natural harmony between their souls that transcended social barriers. But Isabella was right. He also showed signs of interest that went beyond the appropriate. The way he sought her company, how he observed her performances, how he had almost kissed her in the music room. It wasn't her romantic imagination building castles in the air. The sound of footsteps on the gravel alerted her to an approaching presence. When she looked up, she saw Aldrich walking through the garden, clearly looking for her. He wore only a shirt and waistcoat, having discarded his formal coat, and there was something vulnerable in his less polished appearance. "Permit me to join you?" he asked upon reaching the pavilion. Clara nodded, unable to trust her own voice. He sat on the bench beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, but one heavy with tension. "We need to discuss what happened today," he said finally. "Your Grace, Aldrich," he corrected softly. Here, in this moment, just Aldrich. The use of his given name was more intimate than any physical caress could have been. Clara breathed deeply, gathering courage for the conversation she knew was inevitable. "I know this is impossible," she began. "I know my place, my position." "Your place," Aldrich interrupted, turning completely to face her, "is where your heart guides you." "And mine? My heart has consistently guided me to you." Aldrich's confession hung between them like a musical note suspended in the air, beautiful and dangerous at the same time. Clara felt the world around her tremble slightly, as if the very foundations of her carefully ordered reality were beginning to shift. "You should not say such things," she whispered, but her words lacked conviction. "What would others think? Your daughter, your peers?" "For weeks now, I have not cared what others would think," Aldrich replied, his voice laden with a hopelessness that touched Clara's heart. "Since that first morning, when your music awakened parts of my soul I believed dead forever." A nightingale began to sing somewhere nearby, its lyrical melody providing an incongruous soundtrack to a conversation that could destroy them both. Clara observed Aldrich's hands, elegant and strong, resting on the marble between them. How easy it would be to reach out her own hand and touch his, to establish a physical connection that would seal what his words had begun. "Your wife," she began hesitantly. "Margaret was a love of youth." "Arranged by our families when I was 22, Aldrich interrupted softly. "We grew to respect each other, to care for each other. But there was I never felt for her what I feel for you." The brutal honesty of his confession left Clara speechless. She had imagined the ducal marriage as a grand romance, the loss of Margaret as the destruction of an epic love. To discover it had been more duty than passion, completely changed her understanding of the man beside her. "And what do you feel for me?" she asked, almost fearing the answer. Aldrich finally turned completely to her, and Clara found herself lost in the intensity of his blue-gray eyes. "I feel as though I have been dormant for years, and your presence is the first ray of sunshine after an endless winter. I feel as though every melody you play was written specifically to heal the wounds I carry in my soul." before Clara could respond. The sound of approaching voices alerted them to the proximity of other palace inhabitants. Aldrich immediately stepped back, the transformation back into the formal duke occurring with a swiftness honed by years of social practice. Mrs. Pembridge appeared at the edge of the garden, accompanied by two maids carrying baskets of freshly cut flowers. "Your Grace," she curtsied respectfully, "and Miss Pemberton. What a pleasant coincidence to find you enjoying the gardens." "I was merely discussing the final details of the recital with Miss Pemberton," Aldrich replied with a naturalness Clara secretly admired. "Are the preparations proceeding as planned?" "Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Whitworth assures me the gown will be ready 2 days before the event, and the kitchen staff has already begun special preparations to receive the Earl of Ashworth." As the housekeeper detailed the arrangements, Clara took the opportunity to observe Aldrich discreetly. The ducal mask had perfectly reassembled itself, but she could now discern the subtle tensions that revealed the man behind the title, the slightly rigid line of his jaw, the way his fingers tapped almost imperceptibly against his thigh. "Miss Pemberton," Mrs. Pembridge addressed her, "Lady Isabella was looking for you. Something about reviewing the piece you are to play together for the recital." "Of course." Clara stood, adjusting her skirts. "I shall go find her immediately." As she passed Aldrich, their gazes met briefly, a silent communication passing between them. There were unspoken promises in that look, as well as a mutual acceptance that the conversation begun in the pavilion was far from over. Clara found Isabella in the smaller drawing room adjacent to the library, surrounded by sheet music scattered over a Persian rug. The young aristocrat was biting her lower lip in concentration, clearly frustrated with something. "Lady Isabella, were you looking for me?" "Oh, Miss Clara." "What a relief!" Isabella sprang to her feet. "I am having difficulty with the transition in the third movement of our duet piece. I cannot make it sound natural." Clara knelt beside the young lady, examining the score in question. It was an elegant composition by Handel, adapted for harpsichord and voice, which they had chosen as the finale for their joint performance. "Show me exactly where," Clara requested, noting the pencil annotations Isabella had made in the margins of the score. For the next 40 minutes, they worked on the troublesome passage, with Clara demonstrating the technique on the imaginary harpsichord formed by the coffee table, while Isabella practiced the vocal part. Gradually, Clara realized that the young lady's difficulty was not technical, but emotional. "Is there something else bothering you?" she asked gently, when Isabella missed the same passage for the 5th time. The young lady hesitated, nervously toying with the ribbons of her dress. "Miss Clara, may I ask you a personal question?" "Certainly." "Have you ever been in love?" The question caught Clara completely off guard. Her cheeks warmed involuntarily, and she had to avert her gaze from Isabella's curious intensity. "Why do you ask such a thing?" "Because lately I've been thinking about it a great deal." Isabella sat on the sofa, pulling her knees to her chest in a way that made her seem younger than her 15 years. "Mama died when I was 12. I barely remember what it was like between her and Papa when they were happy together." Clara felt her heart constrict at the vulnerability in the young lady's voice. "I am sure they were very happy." "Perhaps," Isabella agreed without conviction. "But sometimes I wonder if Papa knows how to be happy again. He has been so different since you arrived." The comment made Clara stiffen. "Different how? More alive, I suppose. He smiles more, especially when he hears you play. And yesterday I heard him whistling in the corridor. I haven't heard him whistle since before Mama died." Each revelation was simultaneously wonderful and terrifying. Clara was beginning to comprehend that her impact on Aldrich's life was more significant than she had imagined, which made the situation even more complicated. "Your father has been through a very difficult period," she said carefully. "It is natural that he is beginning to recover now. But why now?" Isabella insisted with the relentless logic of youth. "Why not a year ago or 2? What has changed?" Clara had no answer to that question, at least none she could share with the daughter of the man she was learning to love. Instead, she delicately redirected the conversation back to the music. "How about we try the piece again? I believe focusing on the feelings the music evokes might help with the technique." They spent the rest of the afternoon rehearsing, but Clara could barely concentrate fully. Her conversations with Aldrich and Isabella echoed in her mind, creating a complex mosaic of hopes and fears. When they finally parted for dinner, Clara felt emotionally exhausted. Returning to her chambers, she found a surprise awaiting her on her writing desk, a single white rose with a small note attached. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper and recognized Aldrich's elegant handwriting. To someone whose music has brought spring back to my soul. Meet me in the private library at 10 o'clock. There is something I must show you. Clara held the note against her chest, her heart beating erratically. The white rose was a symbol of pure love, a choice that could not be a coincidence. Aldrich was clearly determined to pursue what he had begun in the garden, regardless of the consequences. The hours until their meeting dragged like centuries. Clara changed her dress 3 times before settling on the navy wool one that best highlighted her eyes. She brushed her hair until it shone like brown silk, pinning it in a more elaborate chignon than usual. When the clock tower chimed 10 strokes, she was already standing before the private library door. Gathering the courage to knock, enter. Aldrich's voice sounded muffled through the heavy wood. Clara pushed the door open and immediately perceived that something had changed in the room. Additional candles lit the library, creating a more intimate atmosphere than the usual lighting. Aldrich was standing near the fireplace, having exchanged his formal attire for a white linen shirt and riding breeches, an informality that made him seem more approachable and, paradoxically, more attractive. "You came," he said, as if he had doubted she would appear. "I could not stay away," Clara admitted honestly. Aldrich approached her slowly, as if fearing she might flee. When he stopped just an arm's length away, Clara could see the fireplace flames reflected in his eyes. "There is something I need to show you," he said, walking towards a table where an object covered by a velvet cloth awaited. "Something that explains why I can no longer fight what I feel." With ceremonious movements, he removed the cloth, revealing a miniature portrait framed in gold. Clara stepped closer to examine it better and saw the face of a conventionally beautiful blonde woman, clearly painted in the formal style of matrimonial portraits. "Margaret," Aldrich said unnecessarily. "Painted shortly after our wedding," Clara observed the portrait, trying to understand what Aldrich wanted her to see. She was a beautiful woman, certainly, but there was something distant in her expression, a formality that not even the artist's skill had managed to warm. "For 3 years, this portrait was all that remained of her," Aldrich continued, his voice taking on a contemplative tone. "I looked at it every night, trying to recall what we had shared, trying to feel the devastating grief I imagined I ought to feel." He paused, turning to face Clara directly. "But when I see you, when I hear your music, I feel more life in one moment than I have in 23 years of respectable marriage." The confession was so raw, so vulnerable, that Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She understood then why Aldrich had shown her the portrait. Not to compare her to Margaret, but to illustrate the difference between duty and choice, between respectful affection and true passion. "Aldrich," she said his name for the first time, savoring how it sounded on her lips. "You know this cannot lead to anything traditional. I cannot be your Duchess." "Then be my Clara," he interrupted, finally closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his. "Be the music that reanimated my soul, the spring that ended my perpetual winter." And then, finally, he kissed her. The kiss was like the first note of a long-awaited symphony, soft and hesitant at first, then growing in intensity until it became a full declaration of weeks of suppressed feelings. Clara felt herself melt against Aldrich's chest, her hands finding purchase on the lapels of his linen shirt as the world around them completely disappeared. When they finally parted, both remained close enough for their breaths to mingle, forehead against forehead as they had done in the music room, but now without hesitation or fear of being discovered. "Clara." Aldrich murmured her name like a prayer, his hands gently framing her face. "Tell me I am not the only one to feel this." "You are not," she whispered back, surprising herself with her own courage. "I too have struggled against these feelings for weeks, trying to convince myself it was merely gratitude for your kindness or admiration for your position. And now?" Clara raised her eyes to meet his, seeing reflected there the same mix of longing and vulnerability she knew was etched on her own face. Now I know it is much more than that. It is as if my soul recognizes yours." Aldrich closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing her words. When he opened them again, there was a determination there that made Clara's heart quicken. "Then let us fight against it no longer," he said, gently leading her to the armchairs near the fireplace. "Not when life has already denied us so much." Clara allowed herself to be guided, conscious that she was crossing a boundary from which she might never be able to return. As they settled into the armchairs, Aldrich kept one of her hands nestled between his, the simple yet intimate touch sending waves of warmth through her entire being. "We must be practical," he said finally, though his voice revealed a reluctance to address the realities that surrounded them. "I cannot offer you marriage, not without causing a scandal that would destroy not only myself, but you and Isabella." Clara nodded, though she felt a pang of pain upon hearing confirmed what she already knew. "I understand the limitations of your position, and of mine. But that does not mean we must content ourselves with only this night," Aldrich continued, leaning slightly towards her. "There are arrangements that could be made. A smaller property on the ducal lands where you could reside as the family's private musical consultant. You would be comfortable, respected, and you could visit when it was convenient," Clara finished, surprising herself to find that the idea did not offend her as it should have. In other circumstances, such an arrangement would be degrading, a position that would place her dangerously close to the status of a kept mistress. But there was something in the way Aldrich proposed it, with respect and genuine consideration for her well-being, that transformed the suggestion into something different. "It would not be perfect," he admitted, "but it would be ours." Clara remained silent for a few moments, contemplating the flames dancing in the fireplace as she processed the proposal. It was an extraordinary offer, considering the difference in their social positions. Aldrich was essentially offering her financial security and a genuine relationship, even if he could not offer social legitimacy. "And Isabella?" she asked finally. "How would we explain my continued presence on your lands?" "Isabella has already shown genuine affection for you," Aldrich replied. "Her musical education could continue, and gradually she would come to understand the nature of our connection. My daughter is more perceptive than I imagine she herself realizes." The mention of the young girl brought a new dimension to the situation. Clara had developed a genuine affection for Isabella, and the idea of abandoning her after the conclusion of her official lessons caused her genuine sadness. Remaining in the vicinity would allow her to continue being a positive presence in the teenager's life. "It would be a silent scandal," she murmured, more to herself than to Aldrich. "The best relationships in the aristocracy often are," he replied with a touch of bitter irony. "At least ours would be based on genuine affection, not political convenience." The sound of distant footsteps in the corridor alerted them to the reality of the outside world. Immediately, both drew back slightly, though Aldrich kept his hand in a position that could be interpreted as merely courteous by any casual observer. "You need not answer tonight," he said when the footsteps faded. "I know it is much to process." Clara observed him intently, noting the small lines of tension around his eyes that revealed how important her answer was to him. This powerful and influential man was essentially placing his heart in her hands, offering everything his position allowed. "There is something else I must consider," she said softly. "My siblings, Edmund and Sophia, depend on the remittances I send. If I accept your proposal, how would you ensure they continue to be properly cared for?" The relief that shone in Aldrich's eyes suggested that he interpreted the question as evidence she was seriously considering the offer. A pension would be established for them immediately. Edmund could continue his studies at the best school in the region, and Sophia would receive an education appropriate for a young lady. When she came of age, a suitable dowry would ensure she could make a respectable marriage. The generosity of the offer touched Clara deeply. Aldrich was not only thinking of her, but of her entire family, ensuring that accepting his heart would not mean abandoning her responsibilities. "You are very generous," she said, feeling tears of gratitude prick her eyes. "It is not generosity," Aldrich replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a chaste kiss. It is love. Love for you and for all that is important to you. The word love hung between them like a blessing. It was the first time either of them had used the term directly, and its weight completely transformed the atmosphere of their meeting. "I love you too," Clara whispered, the words leaving her like an exhalation. I tried to resist, to convince myself it was improper, impossible. But the heart has its own laws, Aldrich completed, echoing a saying she had heard her father repeat years before. They remained thus for several minutes, simply absorbing the reality of their mutual feelings and the possibilities opening before them. The library clock struck 11 chimes, reminding them that the night was advancing, and Clara should return to her chambers before her absence was noted. "The recital," she said suddenly, remembering the rapidly approaching event. "How should we proceed until then?" "With caution," Aldrich replied, though his reluctance was evident. "We cannot allow suspicions to arise before we have the opportunity to make suitable arrangements. After the performance, when the guests have departed, we can discuss the practical details of our new situation." Clara nodded, understanding the wisdom of this approach. The recital would be her official introduction to local society, and any hint of impropriety could ruin not only her reputation, but Aldrich's and Isabella's as well. "It will be difficult to feign indifference," she admitted with a shy smile. "For me, too," Aldrich agreed, rising and extending a hand to help her up. "But think of it as our first performance together, a demonstration of our ability to harmonize perfectly." The musical analogy drew a soft laugh from Clara, and she realized how natural and comforting it was to converse with Aldrich in this manner. There was no forced formality between them now, only the ease of two people who knew each other deeply, despite their brief acquaintance. When they reached the library door, Aldrich hesitated before opening it. "Clara," he said, using her name with a familiarity that still made her tremble slightly. "Know that whatever your final decision, these moments have been the happiest I have known in years." Impulsively, Clara rose on her tiptoes and placed a soft kiss on his cheek, a gesture of affection that silently sealed her intention to accept his proposal. "Until tomorrow," she whispered, and then slipped through the ajar door like a shadow. The corridor was plunged in darkness, lit only by a few strategically placed candles to guide nocturnal movements. Clara walked slowly back to her chambers, her heart still beating erratically from the evening's events. In a few days, her life had transformed from an existence of solitary responsibility into a promise of love and security she had barely dared to imagine possible. When she finally reached her room, she found a second white rose on her pillow, without a note this time, but with a sapphire blue ribbon tied to the stem. The same color Isabella had chosen for her recital gown. Clara held the rose against her chest, understanding the implicit message. Aldrich not only loved her, but already saw her as an integral part of his family, someone whose tastes and preferences were considered even in the smallest details. As she prepared for sleep, Clara allowed herself, for the first time in years, to dream of a future that included more than mere survival, a future where she could be loved and valued not just for her usefulness, but for who she truly was. And as sleep finally claimed her, the scent of white roses filled her dreams with promises of springs to come. The morning of the recital dawned with a golden mist that spread over the gardens of Raven's Hollow like a veil of promises. Clara awoke before the chapel bells chimed, her heart already thrumming with the anticipatory anxiety that had grown over the 3 days since her mutual confession with Aldrich. Each subsequent encounter had been a careful dance of forced normalcy, stolen glances, and casual touches that burned like embers against her skin. The sapphire blue gown hanging in her wardrobe seemed to radiate a light of its own in the morning gloom. Mrs. Z. Whitworth had surpassed all expectations, creating a piece that would transform Clara from a mere governess into someone worthy of occupying the most refined, aristocratic salons. The silk brocade shimmered with subtle golden threads, and the Brussels lace that adorned the sleeves was a work of art in itself. Clara approached the window, observing the already intense activity in the gardens, where gardeners positioned additional lanterns and floral arrangements on the paths that would lead guests to the palace ballroom. Carriages would begin to arrive in mid-afternoon, bringing the county's elite to witness not only her musical performance, but unconsciously, the public birth of her new role in Aldrich's life. A soft tap at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Clara?" Isabella's voice sounded through the wood, laden with barely contained excitement. "Come in, Lady Isabella." The young lady burst into the room with characteristic energy, already dressed in her morning muslin gown. Her golden curls had been arranged more elaborately than usual, anticipating the formal coiffure she would receive later. "I couldn't sleep properly," Isabella confessed, throwing herself into the armchair near the window. "I keep wondering if I'll remember all the words to our song, or if my hands will tremble too much on the harpsichord." Clara smiled tenderly, recognizing the same fears that plagued her, though for far more complex reasons. Pre-performance nerves are natural. "But remember that you already perfectly master the piece. Your technique is impeccable. And you? Are you nervous too?" More than Isabella could imagine, Clara thought. "A little. But when we begin to play, the nerves will transform into music." Isabella studied her with that perceptive gaze she had inherited from her father. "Papa seems different this morning too, more tense perhaps." He checked the ballroom arrangements 3 times, when he would normally delegate everything to Mr. Hartwell. Clara's heart quickened slightly. Aldrich was evidently as affected by the proximity of the event as she was. Tonight represented more than a simple musical performance. It was her official entry into the social circle that would unknowingly witness the beginning of a new era in their lives. "Your father wants everything to be perfect for you," Clara replied diplomatically. "This is your first important public performance since Mama's death," Isabella completed without bitterness. "Yes, I understand. And I appreciate that you are by my side for this. I don't know if I would have the courage to do it alone." The sincerity in the young lady's voice touched Clara deeply. During her weeks at Ravenshollow, she had developed a genuine affection for Isabella, and the prospect of remaining in her life through Aldrich's proposed arrangement brought her unexpected satisfaction. "I will always be here for you," Clara said, the words carrying a deeper meaning than Isabella could comprehend at the moment. The following hours passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Clara submitted to the ministrations of Mrs. Pembridge, who insisted on personally overseeing her transformation for the evening. Her bath was perfumed with lavender and rose oils. Her hair was washed until it shone like brown silk, and her hands received special treatment with imported creams that would leave them soft as petals. As she waited for her hair to dry completely, Clara finally had a moment of quiet to contemplate the magnitude of the approaching change. Tomorrow, when the guests had departed and the dust of the event had settled, she would have a definitive conversation with Aldrich about the practical details of their future together. The pension for her siblings, the small property where she would reside, the discreet arrangements that would allow their relationship to continue. It was simultaneously terrifying and thrilling to consider abandoning the precarious independence she had carved out for herself in favor of security based on a man's love. But Aldrich was not just any man. He was someone who had shown genuine respect for her intelligence and talent, who valued her opinion and cared for her well-being. The sound of carriages arriving in the main courtyard filtered through the closed windows, signaling the beginning of the guests' arrival. Clara felt a wave of genuine nervousness mingle with the romantic anticipation that had consumed her for days. "Miss Clara." Mrs. Pembridge's voice called her back to the present. "It is time for us to prepare properly." The process of dressing became a ceremony in itself. First came the undergarments, a chemise of fine linen, a precisely fitted stays to enhance her natural silhouette, petticoats that would give the gown its proper volume. Then, finally, the sapphire blue gown itself slid over her form like liquid water, fitting perfectly to every curve of her body. When Mrs. Pembridge finished fastening the small pearl buttons that ran down her back, Clara barely recognized the woman who observed her from the Venetian mirror. The gown had completely transformed her appearance, elevating her from respectable governess to a lady of unquestionable refinement. The sapphire blue enhanced the color of her eyes, while the elegant cut of the décolletage hinted without ever being improper. "You look dazzling, miss," Mrs. Pembridge declared with maternal satisfaction. "His Grace will be—" "That is, all the guests will certainly appreciate your elegance." The housekeeper's slip did not go unnoticed by Clara, who wondered how many of the senior household staff had perceived the subtle changes in the dynamic between her and the Duke. Experienced servants developed a sixth sense for the undercurrents flowing through grand, aristocratic houses. Her coiffure was the final touch. Her brown hair arranged in soft waves that framed her face, with strands strategically placed to catch the light of the chandeliers. A simple set of pearls, borrowed from Isabella's personal collection, completed the transformation. When she finally descended the main staircase of the palace, Clara felt as if she were floating. The ballroom was already buzzing with activity, with elegantly dressed guests circulating amongst champagne flutes and animated conversations. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light prisms over the ladies' colourful gowns and gentlemen's formal uniforms. Her eyes found Aldrich immediately, as if a magnetic force guided them through the crowd. He stood near the main fireplace, conversing with a middle-aged gentleman Clara assumed to be the Earl of Ashworth. When Aldrich saw her, his expression subtly shifted, not enough to be noticed by casual observers. But Clara caught the admiration and longing that briefly flashed in his eyes before the ducal mask reassembled itself. "Miss Pemberton." His voice reached her as she approached, formal but imbued with implied warmth. "Allow me to introduce you to the Earl of Ashworth. My lord, this is the exceptional music instructress who has been guiding my daughter." The Earl was a portly man of approximately 50 years, with neatly trimmed grey moustaches and intelligent eyes that assessed Clara with respectful interest. "Miss Pemberton, the pleasure is mine. Your reputation precedes you. I have heard enthusiastic reports of your musical abilities." "Your lordship is very kind," Clara replied with a proper curtsy, aware that Aldrich observed every nuance of her interaction with the guest of honor. "I understand you will favor us with a demonstration of your talent this evening," the Earl continued. "I am particularly eager to hear the Bach sonata that Ravenshollow mentioned." The conversation proceeded for a few minutes, with Clara demonstrating exactly the kind of social grace Aldrich had expected of her. When other guests approached to greet the Earl, she discreetly withdrew, allowing attention to turn to matters more befitting the social standing of those present. Isabella appeared by her side like an apparition in white taffeta, her own nerves evident in the intense sparkle of her eyes. "Miss Clara, you look absolutely magnificent. Papa could not stop looking when he saw you descend the stairs." "Isabella," Clara murmured, glancing quickly around to ensure no one had overheard the indiscreet remark. "Oh, do not worry," the young lady chuckled softly. "Everyone is too engrossed in their own conversations to pay heed. But I can tell you that several ladies have already inquired who the beautiful stranger is." The comment made Clara realize that her transformation had been more successful than she had imagined. Several people observed her with genuine curiosity, clearly intrigued by her presence among the local elite. It would be necessary to carefully navigate through the introductions and conversations that would follow, establishing her credibility without revealing too much about her circumstances. Dinner was a test of social endurance. Clara found herself seated between the local magistrate's wife and a young baronet who showed considerable interest in her opinions on music and literature. She managed to maintain intelligent conversations without compromising her position, always conscious of Aldrich's occasional gaze from the opposite end of the table. When the time for musical performances finally arrived, Clara felt a familiar mix of nervousness and anticipation. The grand harpsichord had been positioned in the center of the hall, surrounded by chairs arranged in a semicircle for the audience. Additional lanterns were lit to ensure adequate lighting, and an expectant silence descended upon the gathered guests. Isabella would be the first to perform, playing a solo piece by Mozart that she had completely mastered during her lessons. Clara watched from the side of the hall as the young girl settled onto the harpsichord bench, her small but steady hands finding the keys with growing confidence. The performance was impeccable. Isabella played with a musical maturity that surprised even Clara, each musical phrase clear and expressive. When the last chords faded into the perfumed air of the hall, the applause was genuinely enthusiastic. Aldrich radiated paternal pride, and Clara felt a wave of satisfaction at seeing her pupil triumph so completely. "And now," the Earl of Ashworth announced, rising from his chair, "I understand we shall be treated to a performance by the talented Miss Pemberton, followed by a duet with our young hostess." Clara took a deep breath, adjusted the skirts of her sapphire blue gown, and walked to the harpsichord. The silence that fell upon the hall was different now, more attentive, more critical. These were connoisseurs of music, people who had heard the finest performers in London and on the continent. Her reputation and her future depended on the next few minutes. Her hands found the keys, and the first notes of the Bach sonata flowed through the hall like pure water over polished stones. Clara allowed all the emotion of the past few days, the newfound love, the hope of a secure future, the gratitude for this extraordinary opportunity, to pour forth through her music. She played not only for the gathered guests, but for Aldrich, who remained motionless by the fireplace, his eyes never leaving her. She played for Isabella, who watched with growing admiration. She played for herself, for the woman she had discovered herself to be through the love of a man who truly saw her. When the last note echoed into the complete silence, the moment of pause that followed seemed eternal. Then, like a breaking wave, applause erupted through the hall with an intensity that made Clara blush with genuine pleasure. "Extraordinary," she heard someone murmur. "Simply extraordinary." The duet with Isabella that followed was a triumph of harmony and collaboration. Their voices intertwined with the harpsichord melodies in a display of technique and sensibility that left the audience visibly moved. When they finished, Clara noticed that several ladies discreetly dabbed at tears, and even some of the gentlemen seemed deeply touched. The compliments that followed were a blur of smiling faces and kind words. Clara found herself at the center of an admiring circle, with requests for future performances and invitations to visit other estates. It was exactly the kind of recognition that could open doors to an independent musical career, should she choose it. But her eyes kept searching for Aldrich through the crowd, longing for his approval above all others. When they finally managed a moment of private conversation during the refreshment interval, he approached with an expression that blended pride, admiration, and something deeper. "Clara," he said in a low voice, using her name with an intimacy that sent shivers through her skin. "You were absolutely magnificent. Every person in this hall now understands why I consider you so special." The word special carried layers of meaning that only the two of them understood. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest, a sense of triumph that went far beyond professional satisfaction. "Thank you," she replied, her voice almost a whisper in the momentary intimacy they created amidst the crowd. "But your approval means more to me than all the applause in the world." The look he gave her burned with an intensity that made Clara wish they could escape, find a private place where they could speak freely about the future that awaited them. But social duties kept them bound to the hall, playing their parts for an audience unaware of the silent revolution unfolding before their eyes. "Papa has been talking with Lord Ashworth for over 15 minutes. Isabella appeared beside them, interrupting the charged moment. "I believe they are discussing the possibility of Miss Clara giving lessons at other estates in the region." The information made Clara frown slightly. Such arrangements would considerably complicate the plans she and Aldrich had discussed. If her reputation as a musician spread too widely, it might become difficult to explain her continued presence in the vicinity of Ravenshollow without raising suspicions. "What kind of arrangements?" she asked carefully. Lord Ashworth mentioned that his niece would require musical instruction before being presented at court next year, Isabella explained, animated by the conversation she had overheard. "And Lady Pemberton said her youngest daughter demonstrates great interest in the harpsichord." Aldrich returned at this moment, his expression revealing a tension that Clara immediately recognized. He greeted them both with formal courtesy, but Clara perceived the conflict in his eyes. Were the conversations productive? She asked diplomatically. "Extremely," Aldrich replied, though his voice carried a note of irony that only she could detect. "It seems your performance has created a considerable demand for your services." The rest of the evening passed in a controlled whirlwind of social conversations and elaborate farewells. Clara found herself promising to consider various employment offers, while mentally calculating how to honor the social commitments she had, inadvertently created without compromising the plans she had made with Aldrich. When, finally, the last carriage disappeared into the nights, darkness and the sounds of the palace quieted. Clara remained in her room, still wearing the magnificent sapphire blue gown, awaiting the agreed-upon signal that would indicate Aldrich was free for their definitive conversation. The white rose arrived shortly after midnight, slipped under her door with a note that simply read, "Library. Now." Clara traversed the silent corridors like an apparition in blue silk, her heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. This conversation would determine the course of her future life, sealing the agreement that would forever transform her position in the world. Aldrich awaited her by the windows that overlooked the moonlit gardens. He had dispensed with his formal cravat and unbuttoned the top buttons of his shirt, an informality that made him more approachable and, paradoxically, more attractive. When she entered, he turned with an expression that blended relief, desire, and something that seemed almost melancholic. "Clara," he said, opening his arms in a clear invitation. She ran to him without hesitation, allowing herself to be enveloped in an embrace that seemed to seal all the unexpressed feelings of the night. For several moments they remained like that, simply absorbing the physical closeness they had been forced to deny during the public hours. "You were perfect tonight," Aldrich murmured against her hair. "Every person in the hall was enchanted with you. I am proud to know that you chose me." Clara pulled back slightly so she could look at him. "And you chose me too. But the offers I received tonight, they complicate our plans, don't they?" Aldrich's smile took on a tense quality. "Lord Ashworth was quite insistent about your availability to instruct his niece. And when I mentioned that I intended to keep you as a private musical consultant for our estate, he made some comments that suggested curiosity about the exact nature of such an arrangement." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of comments?" "Nothing directly offensive," Aldrich quickly reassured her. "But observations about the unusual generosity of keeping such a talented musician exclusively for one family, when she could be earning a considerable fortune, giving lessons throughout the region." The implication was clear. Any arrangement that kept Clara in the vicinity of Ravenshollow without a convincing professional explanation would raise suspicions among people well-versed in the social customs of the aristocracy. "So, our original plans are impossible?" Clara asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the disappointment she felt growing in her chest. "Not impossible," Aldrich said firmly, taking her hands in his. "But they require creative adjustments." He led her to the armchairs near the fireplace, where papers waited on a low table. Clara recognized legal documents, official seals, and the elaborate calligraphy of formal contracts. "I have spent the last week discreetly consulting my solicitors in London," Aldrich explained, arranging the documents. "There are legal precedents for what I have in mind, though they are rather unconventional." Clara examined the papers with growing perplexity. There were references to properties, annuities, legal guardianships, and terms she did not fully understand. "Explain it to me simply," she asked. Aldrich took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a proposal he knew to be extraordinary. "What if I were to legally adopt you as my ward?" The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the library. "Adoption? Not as a daughter," Aldrich clarified quickly, "but as a legal ward. It is an old but respectable arrangement, historically used by nobles to protect talented young people who had lost their families. It would provide legal justification for your permanent presence on my estates, your sustenance and protection, and eliminate any questioning about the propriety of our relationship." Clara slowly processed the implications of the proposal. As Aldrich's legal ward, she would have defined social status, financial security, and continuous access to his presence. But she would also be legally under his authority in a way that could limit her independence. "And our personal connection?" she asked delicately. Aristocratic wards often marry their legal guardians when they come of age, Aldrich replied, his eyes never leaving hers. It is socially accepted, even expected in some circumstances. In 2 years, when you turn 21, we could marry without causing scandal. The proposal was so unexpectedly respectable that Clara needed a few moments to absorb all its ramifications. Real marriage, social legitimacy, a future that included not only love, but also public recognition of their union. Would your peers accept an ex-governess as a duchess? Clara asked, touching on the heart of her own insecurities. As my educated ward, a talented young woman under my protection who has grown in refinement and sophistication. Yes, Aldrich replied with conviction. Your performance tonight proved that you possess the necessary natural grace. The rest can be taught. Clara rose and walked to the window, observing the moonlit gardens as she contemplated the magnitude of the proposed change. In a matter of minutes, her life had transformed again, this time from an uncertain future as a kept mistress to the promise of becoming a legitimate duchess. And my siblings? They would automatically be elevated in status as relatives of my ward, Aldrich explained, approaching her. Edmund could attend the best schools without question, and Sophia would receive an education befitting a young lady of the minor gentry. When she came of age, she would have access to the social circles necessary for an advantageous marriage. The generosity of the offer touched Clara deeply. Aldrich was not only thinking of her, but of her entire family, elevating them from modest circumstances to opportunities they could never have dreamed of. Is there a price for such generosity? She asked, turning to face him. Aldrich approached until only a few inches separated them. Only your love. And your patience during the 2 years of social propriety we shall need to maintain while the world adjusts to our situation. 2 years of pretense? 2 years of discreet meetings, charged glances across crowded rooms, and stolen nights like this, he confirmed, raising a hand to caress her face. It will be difficult, but the ultimate outcome will be a fairy tale I never imagined possible, Clara completed, leaning into his touch. Then do you accept? In response, Clara rose on tiptoe and kissed him with all the gratitude, love, and hope that filled her heart. The kiss was long and deep, a promise sealed without words. When they finally separated, Aldrich smiled with a happiness that completely transformed his features. Then tomorrow, Miss Clara Pemberton shall officially become Lady Clara Pemberton, ward of His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshollow. And in 2 years. In 2 years, he said, taking her hands and delicately kissing each one. You shall become Clara Whitmore, Duchess of Ravenshollow, my wife and lifelong companion. As they stood together in the moonlit library, surrounded by contracts that would transform their lives, Clara finally understood that sometimes the best endings are not those that arrive quickly, but those worth waiting for. Music had been her language of survival, but love, true, respectful, and transformative, would be her melody for life. Outside the windows, the first blush of dawn began to tint the horizon, promising a new day and a new chapter in their intertwined lives. And somewhere deep within the palace, Isabella slept peacefully, unaware that she would awaken to discover she had gained not only a musical tutor, but a new mother who would love her as her own.